In 1996, a board game called Kill Dr. Lucky came out. It was a wildly fun game where each person took turns trying to, well, kill Dr. Lucky. Now don't judge me, it was a simpler time. The game required each player to take a turn at doing in the Rasputin-like physician, which was so much more difficult than it sounded. It took luck and daring to get the good doctor away from all the other players and do him in, and more often than not, he escaped no worse for wear. In short, he was one hard SOB to kill. I'll go ahead and put a link in the show notes so you can see what I mean. So, what does that have to do with today's case? Well, a lot of what we do here is based on cold, hard fact, and today's case is a little incredible. In fact, you'd be forgiven for thinking that today's file is a little something we overheard at the corner bar. Everything here, like all our cases, has been researched and verified to the best of our ability. So sit back and have a pint as you listen to tonight's tale. Hell, have two if you aren't driving. Case number 27, Durable Mike Malloy. Today on the Noir Factory.
Noir, suspense, true crime, hard-boiled fiction. Explore the dark alleys and cheap gin joints of mob history, noir films, hard-boiled paperbacks, and two-fisted pulp fiction with mystery writer and make-believe detective Stephen Gomez. Grab your fedora and button your lip as you enter the office of the internet's finest fictional detective agency, the Noir Factory.
There really isn't any need for bloodshed. You just do it with a little more finesse. If you slip a tablet into someone's coffee, then it avoids an awful lot of mess. Murder by numbers. The police. In the 20s and 30s, at the height of Prohibition, there were more bars and speakeasies in New York than there have been at any other time in history. And it was no coincidence that there were more drinkers during this time as well. Speakeasies made money during the 30s, lots of money. And while there's no guarantee that owning one made you a wealthy person, a guy with dedication and persistence, a man with vision, a mug with a head for business, could make his mark in the era of Prohibition. Tony Marino, however, possessed none of those traits. Marino was a small-time crook who ran a sleazy speakeasy, and he made extra money through insurance scams. And one of his favorites was the life insurance scam. In 1930, Tony Marino met a homeless woman, and he showed her a small amount of goodwill. Drinks here, some food there. He also took out an insurance policy on the homeless alcoholic woman named Mabel Carson. Marino made himself the beneficiary of Carson's policy, and he continued to treat her well. He had her sign some papers and allowed her to eat and drink at his establishment free of charge. She consumed exactly what one might imagine she would, and at the end of the evening she was an utter wreck. Marino escorted her back to a flop house, where he stripped her down, dosed her bed with a few buckets of ice water, and he opened all the windows to a merciless New York winter. He left her there to the mercy of the elements. A few days later, Marino's friend, Francis Pasquale, an undertaker, used his contacts to get a physician to sign off on an autopsy, saying Mabel Carson had died of pneumonia. And Tony Marino was $2,000 richer for the experience. Now, for a guy who couldn't manage to make a speakeasy profitable, however, $2,000 wouldn't go a long way. After a year or two, Marino was reduced to hanging out with his buddies and trying to come up with a new way to make an undeserved dollar. "Why don't you just take out insurance on Malloy?" Pasquale asked Tony Marino, just according to the newspapers of the day. It was common knowledge among his friends that Tony Marino was a man who knew his way around an insurance policy. Malloy was Michael Malloy, a former firefighter and current transient who was born in County Donegal around 1873. He immigrated to the United States sometime in the early 20th century. He had no friends, no family, and was somewhere in his late 60s, although the mileage he had accumulated made him look a little bit older. History, like life, had not been overly kind to Mike Malloy, and the Daily Mirror, when they reported on him, referred to him as part of the flotsam and jetsam in the swift current of the underworld speakeasy life, those no longer responsible derelicts who stumbled through their last days in a continual haze of Bowery smoke. In short, he was a homeless alcoholic, one of many in New York's roaring 20s. Each day, the old beaten man would enter Marino's speakeasy, and he would greet the bartender. "Another morning, if you don't mind," Malloy would mumble, and the bartender would pour Mike another glass of the cheap stuff. And he continued to pour until Mike lost consciousness and passed out on the floor. Later, when Mike would regain consciousness, the process would start all over again. Mike would pay for his drinks whenever he had cash, and when he didn't, he convinced Marino to extend him a tab. He had even taken odd jobs, cleaning alleys, polishing coffins, and sweeping streets, but the jobs were few and far between. More often than not, Mike wasn't able to pay for his tab, and business at Marino's was suffering. So shooting the bull one day with his buddies, Tony Marino, Francis Pasqua, and Daniel Kreisberg asked each other, how hard would it be, really, to kill a guy who was already intent on killing himself anyway? Marino knew he already had a winning recipe with Maybelle Carson, but the three men felt they could improve their odds. Pasqua and an accomplice, using an alias, went around New York City over the next 5 months, and the two secured 3 insurance policies for the fictitious Nicholas Malloy. 2 policies were with the Prudential Life Insurance Company, and one was with Metropolitan Life, and all 3 paid double indemnity. Pasqua recruited Joseph Murphy, a bartender at Marino's, to identify the body of Michael Malloy as Nicholas Malloy, as well as to claim to be the next of kin and beneficiary. If everything went according to plan, the group would collect over $3,500 from Mike Malloy, which in today's dollars would be about $50,000. But then if things went according to plan, this would be the end of the podcast right now. If you're listening to this on the day it comes out, then it's still March of 2017, and that means it's Tripod Month. What is Tripod Month, you ask? It's a chance to share your favorite or favorites podcasts with the rest of the world by using the hashtag Tripod. It's a movement started out by our pals at NPR to get the word out about podcasting. It simply refers to try a podcast. You know the deal. You're here. Now, we always appreciate the shout-outs we get from our listeners, and you are more than welcome to scream from the rooftops about the Noir Factory if you like. We'll even give you a moment. Cool. But there are also a number of great podcasts out there you might not have heard of. The ones that reach right through your earbuds and grab you by the imagination. I'm talking about Nate DeMeo at the Memory Palace, a silver-tongued devil who makes history into poetry. I'm also talking about Alice Isn't Dead from the same warped minds that bring you Welcome to Night Vale. I'm also talking about Dakota Ring Theater, because they were one of the first great podcasts out there, and they're still the best. And if you haven't given them a listen, brother, go ahead and do so. I also want to give you the skinny on Noir Talk, a brand new podcast from the folks at the Film Noir Foundation. If you like our episodes on Humphrey Bogart, Ida Lupino, hell, if you're here, then you're probably a fan of noir. The people at the Film Noir Foundation live and breathe this stuff. In addition to discovering and restoring cinematic treasures, they put on the traveling film festival extravaganza that is Noir City. So there's that. Check out Noir Talk on iTunes or wherever you find your podcasts, and be sure to use the hashtag Tripod when you share a podcast you find near and dear. Now back to this week's crime, already in progress. Malloy came in that morning, just like clockwork. But today, the service was better than usual. Marino told Malloy that due to increased competition, he had to ease up on the rules, and he granted the man an open-ended tab. The whys probably didn't matter too much to Mike. He bellied up to the bar, and Tony Marino started to pour. And pour. And pour. Malloy had always been a hard drinker all his life, one witness said, and he drank on and on. A legend said that Marino's arms started to ache from all the pouring. After a solid day of hard drinking, Malloy stood up, he thanked Marino for his hospitality, and he stumbled out of the bar. And he showed up the next morning, again, like clockwork. This went on for 3 straight days, with Marino literally serving gallons of the cheap stuff to the old guy, stopping only long enough for Malloy to eat a moldy old sardine sandwich that Marino provided. He hoped that Malloy would fall over and hit his head, or even just choke on a fish bone. But each night, Mike Malloy would thank his benefactors for a hard day's drinking and stumble off into the evening air. On the 4th day, Tony Marino had had enough. He told his friends that he would put a bullet into Malloy's head, but the bartender, Joseph Murphy, convinced them that subtlety was the answer. When Malloy bellied up to the bar on the 4th day, announcing to the world, "Ain't I got a thirst?" Murphy filled a glass for the unfortunate drifter with wood alcohol. In the early days of Prohibition, alcohol was tough to come by, and shady barmen experimented. It was discovered, unfortunately, that as much as 4% wood alcohol in a drink would cause blindness. By 1929, it was estimated that more than 50,000 Americans had died from consuming tainted alcohol. Marino, Murphy, and the others didn't taint the alcohol they served Malloy. They substituted it. Shot after shot Malloy drank as the men in the bar stared hard at him, waiting for him to drop. And Malloy consumed glass after glass of the stuff, achieving his usual drunk, but appeared no worse for the wear. At the end of the evening, he once again wished his hosts adieu and stepped out into the night. And the New York Evening Post would later write, he didn't know what he was drinking was wood alcohol. And what he didn't know apparently didn't hurt him. This went on for days, with Malloy consuming nothing but wood alcohol. Finally, he fell from the stool and he hit the floor. A coughing fit shook his frame, and choking sounds escaped him. Eventually, there was a silence, and his would-be killers exchanged glances. Finally, a sound cut through the silence. A sound of snoring. When Malloy came around, he found his way back up to the bar stool, and he thanked Murphy before asking for another round of the old regular. After almost a week, Marino again wanted to turn to violence, telling his friends that soon they'd be losing money on the deal. The gang brought rotten oysters from a local vendor, and they soaked them in wood alcohol overnight. The next day, they served the oysters to Mike, who was known to have a fancy for seafood. He cleaned his plate, and he asked for more of the lethal rot gut to wash it down. The men brought sardine sandwiches laced with metal shavings for Mike. They fed him sandwiches mixed with ground glass. Yet another time, Malloy dined on a mixture of sardines and rat poison. And they watched him eat every single morsel, and they watched him wash it down with poison. And they waited. And they could have sworn not only was he not feeling the effects of the abuse, he was gaining weight. They did this for a month before gathering to regroup. Clearly this was not working, and they'd gotten away from the original scheme that had worked so well with poor Mabel Carson. One night, after Malloy had passed out, Marino repeated the treatment he'd given to Carson. Marino got Malloy drunk, as usual, and he and his friends drug him to nearby Claremont Park. In the dead of winter, they stripped Mike to his undershirt. They poured 5 gallons of ice water over him, and they left him to die in a snowbank. They then went back to Marino's speakeasy to have some drinks and wait for the horrible news regarding the passing of their good friend, Nicholas Mallory. The next morning, Mike entered the speakeasy in high spirits and a new suit. Malloy told the stunned group that he'd tied one over the night before, and he was found nearly naked, sleeping in a park bench by a couple of cops. The officers were nice enough to show him to a welfare house that fed him, gave him a place to sleep, and outfitted him with a suit. By this time, Marino and his gang had had enough of Malloy's living. The men hired a cab driver, Harry Green, to kill Malloy. Murphy again escorted the slobbering drunk Mike Malloy out of the bar, but this time he took Malloy to the Pelham Parkway and stood him in the middle of the roadway. Then Harry Green backed up his cab 2 blocks for a good head of steam and attempted to run down poor Mike, who managed to stumble backwards just out of the cab's path at the last minute. This was too much. The men took Malloy to the next street over, where they thought they could get a little bit more privacy and to really do it right. Once again, they propped Mike up in the middle of the street, and they had Green take a running start. This time Green hit Malloy straight on, bouncing the unsteady figure over his hood and into the cold streets. Just to be certain, Green put his cab in reverse and backed over Malloy. They went out to check for a pulse, but one of the men saw a headlight, so they sped off. But they didn't need to check, because really, Mike Malloy had to be dead, right? The men went back inside the bar to toast their good fortunes, and they waited for news of the local dead man. Again, days went by with no word. They started to wonder if Malloy didn't crawl away somewhere and die. Weeks went by, and they wondered if Malloy's body hadn't been lost in some bureaucratic snafu. They scoured the newspapers and hospitals with no luck. Even Francis Pasqua's contacts in the morgue and funeral homes were unable to turn up anything. The body of Michael Malloy finally showed up early in February, alive and thirsty. The men watched Malloy settle up in the bar, and they listened in utter disbelief as Malloy told them about wandering out of his speakeasy drunk as a skunk. He remembered a pair of headlights, a sharp pain, and then nothing. The next thing he knew, he woke up in a deep sleep in a warm bed in Fordham Hospital, where they housed him until he healed from his ordeal. He left the hospital and he arrived at his buddy's bar around the usual time, where he greeted the men in his usual way. "I sure am dying for a drink." The gang's final plan came together on February 21st, 1933, 7 full months after the plan to kill Michael Malloy was hatched. Marino rented a room in a tenement about a mile away from the speakeasy. Malloy passed out in the bar, and he was taken to a room where an unknown assailant connected a tube to the gas jet and forced the other end into his mouth. After Mike's body was discovered by a friend of Pasqua's, Dr. Frank Manzella filed a fake death certificate for Nicholas Malloy. The death certificate was given to Pasqua for him to collect on the policies, and an unknown pauper's grave was given to Mike Malloy. The group saw success when they visited the offices of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. They were paid for their policy, $800, double indemnity, and they split up the proceeds at the bar. Marino and Murphy reportedly brought new suits with their share. The group ran into a little bit more trouble when they visited Prudential Life Insurance Company. They had 2 policies there, both for the same individual, and again both policies were double indemnity. Prudential, however, wanted to see the body. Now, in all honesty, the group was beginning to see problems all over the place. They weren't exactly a clandestine organization, and soon almost every speakeasy in New York told a tall tale in their bar about the drunk who couldn't die, and the legend of durable Mike Malloy was born. Marino and his crew tried to talk their way around producing a body, but soon the police were involved and an investigation ensued. The newspaper called the group the Murder Trust, partly because it sold newspapers, and partly because the Brain Trust didn't seem like a good fit. They called Marino's plan the worst insurance scam in history. Dr. Manzella was the first to talk. Harry Green, the cab driver, also made a deal with the prosecution. During the investigation, Michael Malloy was disinterred and a proper autopsy was performed. The effects of carbon monoxide poisoning were immediately evident, and the rest of the group was rounded up. Tony Marino, Daniel Kreisberg, and Francis Pasqua were all convicted of murder and sentenced to death at Sing Sing. All 3 were electrocuted the summer of 1934, and all 3 only needed 1 try.
That closes the books on this case. Join us next time on the wrong side of the tracks at the Noir Factory, as we look at the best in true crime, noir, and hard-boiled stories has to offer. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please subscribe on iTunes and leave an honest review. And be sure to stop by the website to fill up on pulpy and hard-boiled goodness. And remember, nice guys finish last.
Psst, still there? This week's special Noir Factory Dakota message is coming right up. Crack the code by visiting thenoirfactory.com/key.
20, 10, 3, 17, 6, 17, 23, 11. That is all. For the key to this code, visit thenoirfactory.com/key. That's thenoirfactory.com/key. Good night.